In this hint, we're going to give you an overview of monetary policy. We're going to consider the three standard monetary policy tools. The first tool is the discount rate, which we're going to denote as I, and this is going to have an impact on interest rates in general, or at least that's the goal. And in return, that influence on interest rates is seeking to affect primarily the investment component of GDP. The second tool is M for the money supply, and this also is aimed at interest rates and investment. The third is R for the required reserve ratio, and this is seeking to influence the level of reserves and again in turn to influence primarily the investment component of GDP. I have put these in the order that they typically are used. In the modern era, the discount rate is the most common monetary policy tool, followed by the money supply, and required reserve ratios are not a typical tool, although that is an available tool. So how do we use these tools? If we wish to stimulate the economy, in other words, increase GDP, reduce unemployment, and typically this means we are not extremely worried about inflation, or indeed we may have inflation at too low of a level or even deflation. So in any of these situations, what we would do is either decrease the discount rate, increase the money supply, or decrease the reserve ratio. So again, we would either decrease I or R or increase M. Of course, you could also use a combination of these. Conversely, if we wish to dampen the economy, we would either increase the discount rate, decrease the money supply, or increase the required reserve ratio. So again, to dampen or contract or slow down the economy, we would either increase the discount rate or the required reserve ratio, or decrease the money supply. So let's address briefly how the federal government would accomplish each of these actions. It's fairly obvious with respect to the discount rate and the required reserve ratio. These could simply be raised or lowered by government action. Of course, technically, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is a quasi-governmental body since it has both public and private sector representation, but it functions really as part of the federal government. What requires a little more explanation is how the government would go about increasing or decreasing the money supply. Clearly, the government does not go around dropping money out of helicopters or going into your home and asking for cash to remove money from the money supply. So how do they do it? Well, to increase the money supply, to put it most simply, what the government does is pretty much buy bonds. And what you might want to think about is the idea of following the money. If the government buys a bond from the public or a member of the public, it gives money, basically a checking account deposit, an electronic transfer, to the public and takes back a bond and puts that on its balance sheet. So it's actually introducing more money, more cash, into the system. Conversely, if the government wishes to decrease the money supply, if they sell bonds to the public, they remove cash, checking account deposits, from the hands of the public and replace them with bonds which are not part of the money supply. So this is the major way in which the government either increases or decreases the money supply. I'd now like to show you how this works out with respect to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagrams that we've used in earlier material. So we have our price level, our income level here, we have our aggregate demand curve, and we have our short-run aggregate supply curve here. Okay? So if the government undertakes expansionary monetary policy, which means stimulating the economy through increasing the money supply or decreasing the discount rate or the reserve ratio, what will happen is that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Something like this. We're going this way. And we would expect the equilibrium points of the economy to result in an increased income level and also a higher price level, P to P prime, okay? So this is basically the model of expansionary monetary policy, and you might note that it looks exactly the same as when we looked at expansionary fiscal policy earlier. And as you might guess, if we look at contractionary monetary policy, dampening the economy, we would end up shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left, and we would end up having a reduction in the aggregate income at equilibrium and a reduction in the price level. Everything would just go in the opposite direction. Before we close, I'd like to return to our original list of monetary policy tools and just make sure that we understand why, when we seek to decrease interest rates or increase the money supply and thereby decrease interest rates, or increase the amount of reserves available through decreasing the required reserve ratio, why do all of these things help investment? We are saying that we want to impact investment. Why do all these things help investment? Well, basically, they make investment cheaper. If you think of the interest rate as the price of investment, anything that makes that price cheaper is going to, all things being equal, encourage investment. So making interest rates lower, either through the discount rate directly or through increasing the money supply, or through increasing reserves, which would thereby increase the supply of funds available for investment, once again, presumably driving their price down. All of these things should serve to make investment cheaper and thereby encourage it. And this should all work in the reverse. If we're thinking about contractionary policy, then we're seeking to raise interest rates through one of these methods, making investment more expensive and reducing that component of GDP.